The ground gave way slowly, as shovels cut into the damp soil beneath a quiet house in Des Plaines, Illinois. Investigators expected little more than mud, pipes, maybe an animal carcass. What they uncovered instead was a nightmare layered beneath hardwood floors and Christmas decorations. Bone fragments, torn fabric, human remains packed into a crawl space so tight no one could stand upright inside it. The air was thick with decay, and the deeper they dug, the worse it became. This was not a single body. It was many. One by one, the earth surrendered its secrets. Young men, teenagers, sons who never came home, brothers who vanished without explanation. 33 victims in total, buried beneath the life of a man who had shaken hands with politicians, hosted neighborhood parties, and entertained children dressed as a clown. Wayne Gacy had built a world on deception, and in December of 1978, it collapsed. What made the discovery even more horrifying was how ordinary everything looked above ground. Neatly trimmed lawns, a clean driveway, a smiling homeowner known for charity work and civic involvement. Parents trusted him. Employers respected him. No one suspected that beneath his home lay one of the largest serial murder burial sites in American history. As investigators processed the scene, the scope of the crimes became impossible to ignore. Victims had been lured with promises of work, restrained using a method Gacy chillingly referred to as a trick, then sexually assaulted and murdered. Many were strangled. Some were beaten. Their bodies were hidden below his home or dumped into rivers, scattered like trash once the crawl space filled. This was not impulsive violence. It was systematic, rehearsed, repeated over years. The investigation moved fast, driven by mounting evidence and the weight of public outrage. Witnesses came forward, recalling last sightings of missing young men in Gacy's company. Receipts, fibers, and forensic analysis tied victims directly to his home. Surveillance records placed him near disposal sites. Even the soil beneath his fingernails told a story he could no longer escape. When Gacy was arrested, the community erupted in disbelief and grief. Families who had waited years for answers were finally given the truth, but it was a truth that offered little comfort. Mothers learned their sons were gone forever. Fathers were left with anger that had nowhere to go. Entire neighborhoods reeled from the realization that evil had lived among them, unnoticed. The trial that followed exposed every detail to the public. Photographs of the crawl space, diagrams of burial locations, medical testimony describing how each life ended. Gacy was convicted on multiple counts of murder and sentenced to death. The verdict closed the legal chapter, but it opened another, far more brutal one. Because prison is a world governed by its own rules. When Wayne Gacy entered the correctional system, he did not arrive as just another inmate. His name preceded him. His crimes echoed through cell blocks long before he ever stepped inside one. In prison culture, there are offenses that place a permanent mark on a man. Crimes against children and young victims sit at the very top of that list. The first days were a shock to the system. The doors slammed shut, and with them went any illusion of control. No audience to manipulate. He was stripped, searched, processed, and assigned like every other inmate, but the silence around him was intentional. Conversations stopped when he walked by. Eyes followed him, cold and assessing. Violence didn't erupt immediately. It didn't need to. The threat was always there, unspoken and constant. Even correctional officers understood the volatility of his presence. They knew who he was. They knew what he had done. Officially, they were required to treat him like any other prisoner. Unofficially, they kept their distance, aware that a man like Gacy turned any environment into a potential powder keg. This was the moment the power dynamic shifted permanently. Outside, Gacy controlled victims through charm and intimidation. Inside, he was surrounded by men who believed he deserved far worse than the sentence he received. Survival was no longer guaranteed. It had to be earned, carefully, quietly, and often through isolation. If you're finding this story gripping so far, take a moment to support Dark Crime Box by liking this video, subscribing to the channel, and turning on notifications. Your support helps keep these stories told with the seriousness and respect they demand. Because what awaited John Wayne Gacy behind bars wasn't just punishment. It was a daily confrontation with the very evil he had inflicted on others. And this was only the beginning. Inside prison, there is the law written in ink, and then there is the law written in blood. The second set matters more. John Wayne Gacy learned this quickly. Not because anyone explained it to him, and not because a rulebook was handed across a steel desk, but because the silence around him carried meaning. In prison, silence is never empty. It is a warning. It is assessment. It is judgment being passed without a single word spoken. Every facility has its routines, but beneath those routines lives a rigid, unforgiving hierarchy. Crimes are ranked, reputations are weighed, and some names instantly fall to the bottom, where survival becomes a daily negotiation. Gacy's crimes placed him there immediately, not because of rumors or exaggeration, but because the facts were already known, discussed, and despised. Inmate culture does not need court transcripts to understand certain acts. Word spreads through transfer chains, intake whispers, and correctional gossip. By the time Gacy was assigned a cell, men who had never seen the crawl space photographs still knew enough. He was labeled before he ever spoke. And in prison, labels are permanent. There is an unwritten rule that governs all others. Never harm children. Even among murderers, armed robbers, and career criminals, that line holds firm. Those who cross it are considered beyond redemption. They are viewed as predators who preyed on the vulnerable, and no amount of legal sentencing can erase that stain. Gacy did not just cross that line. He obliterated it. As he moved through common areas, he did so under constant scrutiny. Eyes tracked him from behind bars and card tables. Body language shifted when he entered a room. Seats emptied. Conversations ended. This wasn't fear, it was rejection. He was not part of the inmate society, and there would be no path into it. Prison rules dictate respect through strength, alliances, or reputation. Gacy had none of these. His physical presence offered no intimidation. His crimes earned no twisted admiration. And any attempt to assert dominance would have been met with swift, overwhelming violence. He was alone whether he accepted it or not. Another rule became clear just as fast. Mind your space and know your place. In prison, territory matters. Where you sit, where you stand, where you walk. Crossing invisible boundaries can spark conflict instantly. For Gacy, this meant learning to stay small, to move carefully, and to avoid eye contact whenever possible. Isolation was not just imposed by the system, it was enforced by the inmate population. Even simple routines became dangerous calculations. Shower time, meal lines, recreation hours. Every movement carried risk. A bump could be interpreted as a challenge. A glance could be seen as disrespect. And for someone like Gacy, even existing in shared spaces invited hostility. The unwritten rules also govern justice. In prison culture, the legal system is often viewed as incomplete. Some crimes are believed to deserve punishment beyond the courts. While not every inmate acts on this belief, the presence of even one who does is enough to make life unbearable. Threats did not always come in the form of notes or overt gestures. Sometimes they came as deliberate proximity. Sometimes as laughter that stopped too abruptly. Sometimes as an object left too close to his bunk. The message was always the same. You are not safe here. Correctional staff were aware of these dynamics. They monitor behavior patterns closely, especially when housing inmates with notorious crimes. But they cannot erase inmate culture. They can only attempt to contain it. And containing it often means segregation, restricted movement, and limited interaction. For Gacy, that reality began to settle in as days blurred together. The bravado he displayed during trial evaporated in the face of constant vulnerability. This was not a place where charm worked. It was not a place where manipulation thrived. Prison rewarded awareness and punished weakness mercilessly. Even basic communication carried risk. Speaking too much drew attention. Speaking too little invited suspicion. Trust did not exist. Every interaction was transactional, Every gesture weighed for intent. For someone who once thrived on control, this environment was suffocating. And yet, the rules demanded compliance. Break them and the consequences were swift, sometimes administered by inmates, sometimes by the system itself. Either way, pain followed. If you're finding yourself pulled deeper into this story, take a moment to support Dark Crime Box. Liking this video, subscribing to the channel, and turning on notifications helps ensure these stories are told with the seriousness they deserve. Because for John Wayne Gacy, the unwritten rules of prison were not guidelines. They were a sentence within a sentence. And as he learned to navigate them, another reality became impossible to ignore. Guards were watching him too, not with sympathy, but with caution. Because when someone like Gacy enters a prison, everyone understands the same truth. Violence doesn't have to be loud to be inevitable. Correctional officers are trained to remain neutral. Uniforms are meant to erase emotion, to create distance between personal judgment and professional duty. But some names make neutrality almost impossible. John Wayne Gacy was one of them. His file was thick. His crimes were unmistakable. And the weight of what he had done followed him through every corridor he walked. From the moment he was assigned housing, staff understood the risk he represented, not as a predator anymore, but as a target. In a prison environment, notoriety is a liability. Gacy's presence increased tension simply by existing. Officers didn't need to be told to stay alert. They already were. Their approach to him was deliberate and controlled. Procedurally, Gacy received the same intake processing as every other inmate. Searches, counts, medical evaluations. But beyond protocol, there was an unspoken layer of management. His movements were watched more closely. His schedule was adjusted when possible. His exposure to large groups was limited, not as a favor, but as a preventative measure. Guards knew that one lapse could turn deadly. This was not sympathy. It was containment. Correctional staff walk a narrow line. They are responsible for safety, not comfort. And when an inmate carries a reputation like Gacy's, safety requires distance. Officers avoided unnecessary interaction. Instructions were short, direct, and impersonal. There was no casual conversation, no room for familiarity. Some officers admitted later that they found it difficult to even look at him for long. They had seen the evidence. They had read the reports. The images were burned into their minds. Maintaining professionalism meant suppressing instinct, and instinct screamed that this man was different. In high-security environments, officers also understand inmate psychology. They know when someone is seeking attention, when someone is testing boundaries, and when someone is attempting to manipulate. Gacy had a long history of manipulation. Noise levels dropped. These were warning signs correctional staff are trained to recognize. A quiet unit is not always a safe one. As a result, segregation became a restricted access to programs and work assignments. For someone like Gacy, it was both shield and punishment of normalcy. Some guards believed this was the only way to manage him. Others resented the extra effort his presence required. Either way, no one treated him as just another inmate. He had become a logistical problem, a constant risk assessment that never ended. Over time, a pattern emerged. Officers kept emotional distance not just for safety, but for self-preservation. Getting too close to anyone with crimes like his invited moral conflict. It blurred lines. It forced confrontation with acts too disturbing to reconcile with routine duty. So they stayed distant. They enforced rules strictly. They documented everything. They limited exposure. And when possible, they kept him out of sight. But prison is not a sealed system. Information travels. Resentment builds. And no amount of staff oversight can completely eliminate inmate intent. As days turned into weeks, and weeks into years, the pressure surrounding Gacy did not ease. John Wayne Gacy was still surrounded by men who believed he deserved to suffer. And sooner or later, one of them would try to make that belief a reality. As time passed, the tension surrounding John Wayne Gacy hardened into something more dangerous. Brief exposures to shared spaces created flashpoints where control could slip away. At least once, the threat became physical enough that intervention was unavoidable. Whether through a near assault or credible intelligence of an imminent attack, prison officials moved quickly, pulling him back into segregation. These moments reinforced an unspoken truth. Gacy was not being protected out of mercy, but because his death inside the facility would ignite chaos, retaliation, and scrutiny the system wanted to avoid. Survival came at the cost of extreme isolation, where days blurred together and human contact became rare and transactional. In the end, Gacy's existence behind bars became small and tightly managed. He survived not through strength or respect, but through invisibility. Locked away, removed from the general population, and closely monitored, he lived a life stripped of power, status, and audience. The man who once controlled rooms with charm and fear now measured his world in concrete walls and scheduled movement. Prison did not redeem him, but it did dismantle him, reducing his life to routine, confinement, and the constant knowledge that survival depended entirely on distance. The families of his victims, meanwhile, were left with something far heavier than his continued breathing. They carried grief without closure, justice without peace. Gacy's imprisonment did not restore what was taken, and it never could. It only ensured that the harm he caused would end with him. And so the question lingers, long after the cell doors close, is justice measured by how long someone lives behind bars? Or by whether the system can ever truly balance the weight of the lives they destroyed? If this story made you reflect, help support Dark Crime Box by liking, sharing, subscribing, and turning on notifications. Your support ensures these stories are told not for spectacle, but for remembrance and truth.